The city rose from the plains of Mesopotamia like a vision from a fevered dream, its walls stretching toward the horizon in both directions, its towers piercing the sky with an arrogance that seemed to challenge the heavens themselves. Babylon was not merely a city, it was a statement, a declaration carved in brick and glazed tile that announced to the world that human power had reached its apex, that nothing was impossible for those who commanded sufficient resources and ruthless ambition. The Ishtar Gate blazed blue with its processional lions and dragons, mythical beasts parading in endless rows along walls that visitors could spend hours walking without reaching the end. The ziggurat of Marduk dominated the skyline, its terraced levels ascending toward the realm of gods who supposedly blessed this empire above all others. Gardens hung from palace walls, watered by engineering that defied what most people thought possible, green cascading down stone in a deliberate miracle of human ingenuity. This was the centre of the world in the 6th century before the Common Era, the heart of an empire that had swallowed nations and would swallow more before its appetite was satisfied. Nebuchadnezzar Theki sat on its throne, the king who had broken Egypt's power at Carchemish, who had marched his armies to the shores of the Mediterranean, who had reduced proud cities to rubble and proud peoples to servitude. His name was spoken with fear from the Nile to the mountains of Persia. His decisions shaped the fates of millions. His vision for Babylon drove construction projects of such scale that the labourers who built them would not live to see them completed. He was, in his own estimation, and in the estimation of most who encountered him, something very close to a god. Into this overwhelming display of pagan power, in the year 605 BC, and then again in subsequent deportations, came the exiles of Judah, those whom Nebuchadnezzar had torn from their homeland and transplanted to the heart of his empire. They arrived as the spoils of conquest, proof of Babylon's supremacy, living trophies of wars that had ended as all wars with Babylon ended, in Babylonian victory. Jerusalem's walls had fallen. The temple that Solomon had built lay in ruins, its treasures carried off to adorn the shrines of Marduk and the other deities that Babylon served. The Davidic king sat in Babylonian chains. Everything that had defined Judah as a nation, land, temple, monarchy, independence, had been stripped away in a series of catastrophes that left the survivors wondering if God himself had abandoned them. The exiles who walked the streets of Babylon encountered an alien world at every turn. The language that surrounded them was not Hebrew but Akkadian, flowing in unfamiliar rhythms, its cuneiform script bearing no resemblance to the letters their scribes had taught them to read. The gods whose images populated every corner were not the invisible God of Israel, but visible deities of stone and gold, Marduk and Ishtar and Nabu, and a pantheon whose names and natures had to be learned simply to navigate daily life. The food was different, the customs were different, the assumptions about reality itself were different. To be a Jew in Babylon was to exist in a state of perpetual foreignness, surrounded by reminders that you were not home and might never see home again. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a conqueror who extracted tribute and moved on. He was a builder of empire in a more comprehensive sense, and part of his strategy involved absorbing the talented youth of conquered nations into Babylonian service. The best and brightest of Judah's noble families, young men of intelligence and physical excellence, capable of learning Babylonian language and literature, suitable for service in the royal court, were selected for a program of assimilation designed to transform them from Judean exiles into Babylonian administrators. They would be educated in Chaldean wisdom, fed from the king's own provisions, trained in the arts that Babylon's elite employed. After 3 years, they would emerge remade, their loyalties redirected, their identities fundamentally altered. They would serve the empire that had destroyed their homeland, and they would do so not as slaves, but as willing collaborators whose Judean origins had become mere biographical footnotes. Among those selected for this program were 4 young men whose names would become among the most famous in the history of their people: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They had grown up in Jerusalem during the final years of the kingdom, sons of families prominent enough to warrant Babylonian attention. They had been educated in the traditions of Israel, had learned the law of Moses and the songs of David, had worshipped in the temple whose destruction they would later hear about from messengers bearing news that shattered what remained of their former world. They were perhaps teenagers when they arrived in Babylon, old enough to understand what they had lost, young enough to be shaped by the forces now pressing upon them. The Babylonian program of assimilation began with names. Names in the ancient world carried meaning far deeper than modern identification. They expressed identity, indicated divine allegiance, proclaimed what a person was at the core of their being. Hananiah meant, "The Lord is gracious." Mishael meant, "Who is like God?" Azariah meant, "The Lord has helped." Each name contained the sacred syllables of Israel's God, Yah or El, woven into the fabric of their identities from birth. Each name was a confession of faith that these young men had carried since their parents first spoke the sounds over their infant forms. The Babylonians changed those names. Hananiah became Shadrach, a name of uncertain meaning, but certainly stripped of any reference to Israel's deity. Mishael became Meshach, similarly emptied of its theological content. Azariah became Abednego, a name that may have invoked Nebo, the Babylonian god of wisdom and writing. The renaming was not accidental. It was programmatic, designed to sever the connection between these young men and the god their original names had honoured. When Babylon called them, it would call them by names that proclaimed Babylonian supremacy, that reminded them daily of who now held power over their lives. But names could be changed without changing what lay beneath them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we will call them by the names history remembers, the names that the fiery furnace would make immortal, accepted their Babylonian designations as the external impositions they were, masks laid over faces that remained unchanged. They answered when called. They did not make the names occasions for rebellion or confrontation, but in their hearts they remained Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, servants of the god whose name Babylon was trying to erase from their consciousness. The deeper challenge was not nomenclature but compromise. The Babylonian education exposed them to a sophisticated worldview that had its own compelling logic. Chaldean astronomy had mapped the heavens with precision that Judah's scholars could not match. Babylonian mathematics had developed techniques that would influence human thought for millennia. The literature of Mesopotamia was ancient and vast, containing wisdom accumulated across centuries of careful observation and reflection. A young man could study these materials and find much to admire, much to learn, much that would expand his understanding of the world beyond anything his Jerusalem education had provided. The danger was not in the learning itself, but in what the learning was designed to accomplish. Babylon's educational program aimed at more than intellectual development. It aimed at conversion, at the fundamental reorientation of loyalty from the gods of conquered nations to the gods of conquering Babylon. The young men who emerged from this training were expected to have absorbed not merely skills but commitments, not merely knowledge but faith in the Babylonian system that had produced such knowledge. They were expected to conclude that Babylon's gods were stronger than the gods of nations Babylon had defeated, that Marduk's temple rising from Babylon's center proved Marduk's supremacy over the fallen deities of fallen peoples. The three young Hebrews studied what they were given to study. They learned the language, mastered the literature, achieved the academic excellence that the program demanded. They did not isolate themselves in ignorant resistance or refuse engagement with the culture that now surrounded them. But they maintained, through all of it, a core commitment that no amount of Babylonian education could dislodge. The God of their fathers remained their God. The covenant that bound Israel to its creator remained binding on them, even when Israel itself seemed to have been judged and scattered. They lived in Babylon, worked for Babylon, spoke Babylon's language and wore Babylon's clothes, but they did not worship Babylon's gods. This was a quiet faithfulness, not advertised or proclaimed. They did not make scenes about their dietary restrictions or deliver speeches about Babylonian idolatry. They navigated the complexities of their situation with wisdom that sought to honour God without unnecessarily provoking the empire that held power over their lives. The Book of Daniel records how they requested permission to avoid the royal food that would have violated their dietary laws, finding a diplomatic solution that satisfied their conscience without creating confrontation. This was their pattern: faithfulness that was genuine but not theatrical, commitment that was absolute but not provocative. The years in Babylon shaped them without breaking them. They rose through the ranks of imperial administration, their excellence earning recognition, their wisdom winning positions of responsibility in the governance of provinces. Daniel achieved the highest prominence, interpreting dreams that baffled Babylon's own wise men, becoming an advisor whose access to the king exceeded what most foreign exiles could have imagined. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego served in their own spheres. Administrators in the province of Babylon itself trusted enough to be given real authority over Babylonian affairs. They had achieved what the assimilation program was designed to produce: successful integration into the Babylonian system, while somehow remaining something the program was designed to eliminate. Faithful servants of a god Babylon did not recognize. Nebuchadnezzar tolerated this. Perhaps he did not fully understand it, or perhaps he understood it, but considered it an acceptable peculiarity in men who otherwise served him well. The empire was vast enough to accommodate diversity of belief as long as that diversity did not threaten imperial unity. Jews could worship their god in private, could maintain their traditions within their communities, could even rise to positions of influence without completely abandoning their ancestral commitments. Babylon was not, in its ordinary operations, a persecuting power. It was an assimilating power, confident that the overwhelming weight of its culture would eventually erode whatever resistance conquered peoples might initially maintain. But there were limits to Babylon's tolerance, boundaries beyond which diversity became defiance and peculiarity became treason. The God of Israel demanded exclusive worship, and exclusive worship meant that there were things his followers could not do: acts of homage, gestures of religious submission, acknowledgements of divine status, that they could not offer to any being other than the one they served. As long as Babylon's demands remained in the realm of civic cooperation, the tension could be managed. But if Babylon ever demanded what only God could rightly claim, the accommodation would end. The quiet faithfulness would become visible resistance. The exiles who had navigated complexity with such skill would face a choice that admitted no compromise. That moment was coming. Nebuchadnezzar's ambitions were expanding, his sense of his own importance growing with every military victory and construction triumph. The king who had built the greatest city in the world was beginning to imagine himself as something more than human, something worthy of the worship that Babylon's inhabitants offered to the gods whose temples he had erected. The empire that had been content with political loyalty was about to demand religious submission. The furnace that normally served industrial purposes was about to be heated for a different use entirely. In the province of Babylon, 3 young Hebrews continued their administrative duties, unaware that the test they had spent their lives preparing for was about to arrive. The God they served in quiet faithfulness was about to become the center of a public confrontation. The faith they had maintained through years of exile was about to be tried by fire, literally, in flames hot enough to kill anyone who came near them. They had been faithful in small things, in daily choices that no one noticed, in private commitments that cost them nothing visible. Now they would learn whether that faithfulness could sustain them when the cost became everything, when the choice was between bowing and burning, when the empire that had tolerated their difference decided that difference was no longer acceptable. The decree that would force that choice was already being drafted. The golden image that would demand their worship was already being planned. The furnace that would threaten their lives was already being built. And the God they served, the God whose name Babylon had tried to strip from their identities, was already preparing to meet them in the flames. The plain of Dura stretched flat and featureless under the Mesopotamian sun, an expanse of earth that seemed designed by nature to serve as a stage for human ambition. It lay within the province of Babylon, close enough to the capital that travel was convenient, but far enough that construction could proceed without disrupting the city's daily rhythms. Here, on ground that had witnessed nothing more remarkable than the passage of caravans and the grazing of flocks, Nebuchadnezzar chose to erect a monument that would announce his glory to heaven itself. The statue rose 90 feet into the air, 60 cubits in the measurement of the time, and its proportions were deliberately unnatural, elongated to emphasize height over human accuracy, stretching toward the sky in a golden exclamation of power. 9 feet wide at its base, the image tapered upward in a form that some scholars believe represented not a human figure but an obelisk, a pillar of ambition whose shape proclaimed that Babylon's reach extended from earth toward the realm of the gods. The entire surface was overlaid with gold, sheet upon sheet of precious metal, hammered and fitted until the structure blazed in the sunlight with an intensity that hurt the eyes of those who gazed upon it. The cost was incalculable. The gold alone would have financed armies, built cities, purchased the loyalty of nations. The labour required to construct such a monument consumed thousands of workers across months of effort, craftsmen and metalworkers and engineers combining their skills to achieve what the king had envisioned. The logistics of transporting materials to the plain of Dura, of erecting scaffolding tall enough to reach the image's crown, of securing the gold against the winds that swept across the flatland, all of this demanded resources that only an empire at the height of its power could command. Nebuchadnezzar commanded them without hesitation. This was not an expense, it was an investment in something he valued more than gold itself, the absolute acknowledgement of his supremacy. What the image actually depicted remains uncertain across the centuries. Perhaps it represented Nebuchadnezzar himself, a colossal self-portrait that would receive the worship he increasingly believed he deserved. Perhaps it portrayed one of Babylon's gods, Marduk or Nabu, or another deity whose cult the king wished to promote. Perhaps it was deliberately ambiguous, a form that could represent king or god, or the fusion of both that Nebuchadnezzar's growing megalomania was beginning to imagine. Whatever its specific identity, its function was clear. This was an object of worship, a focal point for religious devotion that would unite the empire in a single act of submission. The timing of the statue's construction may have carried its own significance. Some scholars connect it to Nebuchadnezzar's dream recorded earlier in the book of Daniel, the vision of a great statue with a head of gold that Daniel had interpreted as representing Nebuchadnezzar's own kingdom. In that dream, the golden head was followed by inferior kingdoms of silver and bronze and iron, and the entire structure was eventually destroyed by a stone cut without human hands. If this connection is accurate, then Nebuchadnezzar's golden image was a kind of defiant response, an attempt to make permanent what the dream had declared temporary, to construct an entirely golden statue that would admit no succession of inferior kingdoms, no eventual destruction, no power greater than Babylon's own. The dedication ceremony was planned with the same attention to overwhelming effect that had characterized the statue's construction. Invitations went out across the empire summoning officials of every rank to witness and participate. The list preserved in scripture reads like a catalogue of Babylonian administration: satraps and prefects, governors and advisors, treasurers and judges, magistrates and all the other provincial officials. No one of importance was to be absent. No corner of the empire was to be unrepresented. When Babylon made a statement, Babylon made it with the full weight of its assembled authority. They came from every direction, the servants of empire travelling roads that Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns had secured and his building projects had improved. They gathered on the plain of Dura in their official vestments, arranging themselves by rank and region, creating a sea of human presence that spread outward from the base of the golden image in concentric rings of diminishing status. The spectacle was precisely what Nebuchadnezzar had intended, a visual demonstration that all of Babylon's power, all of its administrative reach, all of its human resources existed ultimately to serve the glory concentrated in that towering golden form. Among those assembled were 3 officials from the province of Babylon itself: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their positions required their attendance. Their success in Babylonian administration had been real, and with that success came obligations that could not be avoided without abandoning the roles they had worked so hard to fulfill. They stood among their fellow officials, distinguished from the crowd by nothing visible, 3 more figures in the vast assembly that had gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. They knew, of course, what was coming. The purpose of the gathering was not secret. When an empire constructs a 90-foot golden statue and summons its entire administrative apparatus to assemble before it, the intention is not mysterious. The 3 Hebrews had discussed among themselves, in the privacy of their quarters, what this ceremony would require and what they would do when it required it. The decision they had reached was absolute, though the cost of that decision remained to be seen. They stood in the crowd, waiting, their faces revealing nothing of the turmoil that such waiting might have produced in lesser men. The herald's voice cut through the murmur of assembled thousands, trained to carry across distances amplified by the acoustics of the open plain. Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The command was comprehensive, leaving no ambiguity about what was expected. The musical signal would sound, a cacophony of instruments designed to be audible across the entire assembly, and at that signal, every person present was to prostrate themselves before the golden image. Not merely bow, not simply acknowledge, but worship, the full physical submission that ancient cultures understood as the appropriate response to divine presence. The gesture would communicate total surrender, absolute allegiance, the acknowledgement that whatever this image represented was worthy of the honour that human beings owed only to the gods. Then came the consequence for refusal, delivered with the same clarity that had characterised the command. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. The furnace was not a metaphor. It was a physical structure, visible from where the assembly stood, its flames already burning in preparation for this moment. The industries of Babylon required such furnaces for metalworking and brickmaking, and Nebuchadnezzar had simply repurposed one of these industrial necessities into an instrument of execution. The message was unmistakable. This was not a request, but a requirement, and the penalty for non-compliance was not future punishment, but immediate death. Bow or burn, submit or die. The choice was binary, and the timeline for making it was measured in the seconds between the music's first note and the completion of the prostration it demanded. The psychology of such a moment was precisely calculated. Standing alone against an empire was difficult enough. Standing alone while surrounded by thousands of fellow officials, all of whom were prepared to comply, magnified the difficulty exponentially. Human beings are social creatures, wired for conformity, designed to take cues from those around them about appropriate behaviour. When everyone else bows, the pressure to bow becomes almost irresistible, not because of external threat alone, but because of internal mechanisms that punish deviation from group norms. Nebuchadnezzar understood this. The assembly was not merely for show, it was a mechanism for manufacturing consent, for making compliance feel natural and resistance feel impossible. The music began, the sound rolled across the plain of Dura, horns and flutes and stringed instruments combining in a wall of noise that served less as melody than as signal. The moment of decision had arrived. Throughout the vast assembly, officials began their descent toward the ground, robes spreading around them as they prostrated themselves before the golden image, foreheads pressing into the dust of Mesopotamia, bodies arranged in submission to whatever the towering statue was meant to represent. The wave of prostration spread outward from the image like ripples from a stone dropped into water. Row after row of officials went down, the sound of their movement creating its own kind of music. Fabric rustling, bodies settling, thousands of human beings simultaneously acknowledging that they were less than the golden form that blazed above them. Within moments, the plain of Dura had transformed from a standing crowd into a field of prostrate forms, a harvest of submission laid out beneath the Babylonian sun. But not everyone had bowed. In the section reserved for provincial administrators, 3 figures remained standing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had not moved when the music sounded. They had not begun the descent that everyone around them had completed. They stood upright in a sea of prostration, their vertical forms as visible as the golden image itself against the horizontal landscape of compliance that surrounded them. They had known this moment was coming. They had prepared for it in their hearts long before the herald had issued his command. The decision had not been made on the plain of Dura. It had been made years earlier, in the quiet accumulation of choices that had preserved their faith through all the pressures of Babylonian assimilation. They had eaten different food when the king's provisions violated their conscience. They had maintained their prayers when no one required them to do so. They had kept their hearts oriented toward the God of Israel when everything in their environment encouraged them to forget. This moment was not a new decision. It was the public revelation of a decision they had been making and remaking every day since their arrival in Babylon. The music ended, the assembly began to rise, and as officials regained their feet and looked around at their colleagues, the three standing figures became unmistakably visible. Whispers began immediately, the hushed communications of those who had noticed something irregular, something dangerous, something that could not be ignored. Who were these men? Why had they not bowed? Did they not understand what their defiance would cost them? Some of those who noticed were simply curious, observers of an anomaly that would soon be corrected by the machinery of imperial enforcement. But others noticed with more active interest, their motivations darker than mere curiosity. The Book of Daniel identifies them as Chaldeans, members of the priestly and scholarly class who had particular reasons to resent the advancement of foreign exiles into positions of influence. These men had watched Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego rise through the ranks, had seen foreign captives achieve honours that native Babylonians might have expected to receive, had nursed grievances that now found an opportunity for expression. The three Hebrews had enemies, and those enemies had just been given a weapon. The accusation moved swiftly through the channels of imperial protocol. Certain Chaldeans approached the king, their words carrying the formal deference that court speech required, while their intentions carried venom that no formality could disguise. "May the king live forever," they began, the traditional greeting that preceded all royal communications. Then they reminded Nebuchadnezzar of his own decree, the command to worship, the penalty for refusal, before delivering their accusation with precision designed to maximize its impact. "There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." The accusation was crafted to wound on multiple levels. Some Jews. The ethnic identification reminded Nebuchadnezzar that these were foreigners, conquered, people, exiles who owed their positions entirely to the king's favour. "Whom you have set over the affairs." The reminder that Nebuchadnezzar himself had elevated them made their defiance a personal insult, a betrayal of trust rather than merely a violation of law. "Pay no attention to you." The suggestion that their refusal was not principled religious commitment, but contemptuous dismissal of the king's authority. Every word was chosen to transform what might have been a minor administrative matter into a direct challenge to Nebuchadnezzar's sovereignty. The king's response was immediate and volcanic. Rage and fury. The text uses both words, emphasizing the intensity of emotion that the accusation provoked. Nebuchadnezzar had constructed his golden image precisely to secure the kind of unified submission that these three men were now publicly refusing. Their standing figures on the plain of Dura had been a visual contradiction of everything the ceremony was designed to achieve. They had made him look weak in front of his entire administration. They had suggested that his power had limits, that his decrees could be defied, that something existed in the universe that commanded loyalty more absolute than what he could claim. The summons went out. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were to be brought before the king immediately. The confrontation that had been implicit from the moment they decided not to bow was about to become explicit. The choice they had made in their hearts was about to be tested against the full fury of an emperor who considered himself divine. The furnace, visible across the plain, continued to burn. The flames that would serve as the penalty for defiance leaped and roared, fed by servants who had been instructed to keep them hot. The stage was set for a confrontation between human power at its most absolute and human faith at its most resolved. Three young Hebrews walked toward the throne of a king who had given them one last chance to save their lives. What they would say when they arrived would echo through millennia of scripture and story. What would happen after they said it would reveal whether the God they served was merely a comforting tradition or a living presence capable of meeting them in the flames. The throne had been erected on the plain of Dura itself, a portable seat of judgment that allowed Nebuchadnezzar to preside over the dedication ceremony without sacrificing any of the majesty that normally surrounded him in the palace. Canopies shaded him from the sun. Attendants stood ready to fulfill any command. Guards formed ranks between the king and the crowds, their weapons visible reminders that proximity to power was a privilege that could be withdrawn at any moment. The golden image towered behind this arrangement, its blazing surface creating a backdrop that merged human kingship with divine representation, as if Nebuchadnezzar and the statue were two manifestations of the same, irresistible authority. The three Hebrews were brought before this throne with the efficiency that characterized Babylonian administration, even in its punitive functions. Soldiers escorted them through the crowds, past officials who watched with the morbid fascination that public confrontations always attracted, across the open space that separated the General Assembly from the royal presence. They walked with their heads up, their bearing communicating neither defiance nor submission, simply the composure of men who had already made their decision and were prepared to accept its consequences. Nebuchadnezzar studied them as they approached, his face displaying the particular expression of powerful men confronted with unexpected resistance. There was anger, certainly. The rage that the Chaldeans' accusation had ignited still burned in his eyes, but there was also something like confusion, perhaps even a flicker of respect struggling against the fury that sought to extinguish it. These were men he knew. These were officials he had appointed, administrators whose competence had earned them positions of genuine responsibility. He had elevated them from captive status to provincial authority. Why would they throw all of that away for a gesture of religious stubbornness? The king spoke first, and his words revealed that he was offering them something extraordinary, a second chance. "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" The question was not rhetorical. Nebuchadnezzar was giving them an opportunity to deny the accusation, to claim that there had been some misunderstanding, to provide an explanation that would allow the matter to be resolved without the extremity that the law demanded. Perhaps they had been ill and unable to bow. Perhaps they had been distracted by administrative duties and had missed the signal. Perhaps the Chaldeans who accused them were motivated by jealousy and had misrepresented what they had seen. Any excuse, however flimsy, would give the king a reason to show mercy. He was practically inviting them to lie. The offer continued, becoming even more explicit as Nebuchadnezzar laid out the terms of a reprieve. "Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good." The king was offering to repeat the entire ceremony, to give them a fresh opportunity to comply, to pretend that their earlier defiance had not occurred. The music would sound again, the moment of decision would return, and this time, if they bowed, the matter would end. Their positions would be preserved, their lives would continue, the brief aberration on the plain of Dura would be forgotten, filed away as a minor incident that Babylonian magnanimity had chosen to overlook. Then came the alternative, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who believed his own power was unlimited. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. The furnace was visible from where they stood, close enough that its heat could be felt on exposed skin, close enough that the roar of its flames provided a constant auditory reminder of what awaited those who defied the king's command. Nebuchadnezzar was not speaking in abstractions. He was pointing to a specific death, a particular method of execution, a fate that would unfold within minutes if they maintained their refusal. And then the king asked the question that revealed the theological heart of the confrontation. "Then what god will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The words dripped with contempt. Nebuchadnezzar knew that these men served a different deity, that their refusal to bow was rooted in religious conviction, rather than mere political rebellion. But what could their god do against the power that Babylon represented? Where had their God been when Jerusalem fell, when the temple burned, when the treasures of Israelite worship were carried off to adorn Babylonian shrines? Their God had already been defeated, already been proven inferior to the deities that Babylon served. The question was not genuine inquiry but rhetorical devastation, designed to expose the futility of faith in a God who had manifestly failed to protect his own people. The three Hebrews stood before this challenge, before the offer of mercy and the threat of death, before the contempt for their God and the overwhelming display of imperial power. The golden image blazed behind the king. The furnace roared beside them. Thousands of officials watched to see how they would respond. Every pressure that human psychology could generate was bearing down upon them, urging them to bow, to compromise, to survive. They answered with words that have echoed through every generation since. "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." The opening was remarkable for what it did not contain. There was no pleading for mercy, No negotiation for better terms, no attempt to explain their position in ways that might soften the king's anger. They were not going to argue, they were not going to justify, they were simply going to state what was true and accept whatever followed. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. The first part of their response addressed Nebuchadnezzar's mocking question directly. What God could rescue them? Their God could. The God of Israel, the deity that Babylon considered defeated and irrelevant, possessed power that exceeded anything the furnace could generate. He was able, the word carried theological weight, affirming divine capability in the face of human doubt. They were not serving a weak god or an absent god, or a god whose power had limits that Babylonian flames could expose. They were serving the creator of the universe, the one who commanded forces that made Nebuchadnezzar's furnace look like a candle flame in comparison. But then came the statement that elevated their response from confident faith to something approaching the sublime. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Even if he does not. The three words transformed everything. The Hebrews were not claiming certainty about the outcome. They were not prophesying their own deliverance or guaranteeing that God would intervene to save them. They were acknowledging the possibility that they might actually die, that the furnace might actually consume them, that God might choose not to rescue them from the fate that Nebuchadnezzar had decreed, and they were declaring that this possibility did not change their decision. This was faith of a different order than the faith that expects deliverance and worships in order to receive it. This was faith that worshipped regardless of outcome, that remained loyal even when loyalty led to death, that served God not for what God might do, but for who God was. The three Hebrews were not making a transaction, worship exchanged for protection. They were making a declaration of ultimate allegiance, announcing that their relationship with the God of Israel was unconditional, that nothing Nebuchadnezzar could threaten would alter their fundamental commitment. The emotional weight of such a statement was almost unbearable to contemplate. These were young men, probably still in their 20s or 30s, with lives ahead of them and achievements still to accomplish. They had risen to positions of influence that most exiles could never have imagined. They had families, perhaps, or at least the hope of families. They had futures that reasonable people would consider worth preserving. And they were declaring their willingness to surrender all of it, to walk into flames that would end everything, rather than bow before a golden statue. They were not fanatics seeking martyrdom for its own sake. The calm rationality of their response made clear that they understood exactly what they were choosing and exactly what it would cost. They were men who loved life, who valued their positions, who would have preferred to continue serving in Babylon's administration rather than die in Babylon's furnace. But they loved something more than life, valued something above position, served someone whose claim on their allegiance exceeded any claim that earthly kings could make. And when forced to choose, they chose the greater allegiance. The response also revealed something about how they understood their God. A deity who only deserved worship when he granted worshippers their wishes was no God at all, merely a powerful servant to be hired for favours and dismissed when those favours were not forthcoming. The God of Israel was not such a being. He was sovereign, which meant he made his own decisions about when to intervene and when to allow events to unfold according to their natural course. He was wise, which meant his decisions might not always align with human preferences. He was worthy of worship not because of what he did for his servants, but because of who he was in himself. Even if he chose not to deliver them, he remained the only true God, and they would remain his faithful servants. Nebuchadnezzar's face transformed as he listened. Whatever flicker of respect might have existed was extinguished by a fury that the text describes with deliberate emphasis. He was furious with rage. His attitude toward them changed, and he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The 7-fold increase was probably hyperbolic. Furnaces have practical limits on how hot they can become, but the command revealed the king's psychological state. He wanted these men not merely dead but annihilated, destroyed so thoroughly that nothing remained to suggest their defiance had ever occurred. Their calm refusal had wounded his pride more deeply than open rebellion might have done. They had looked into the face of his power and declared it insufficient to command their worship. The command went out to the strongest soldiers in the army: bind these men and throw them into the furnace. Regular guards would not do. This task required the most powerful warriors Babylon possessed, as if the king feared that lesser men might falter in executing such an order, or as if he wanted the physical impressiveness of his soldiers to communicate one final message about the futility of resistance. The 3 Hebrews were seized, bound in the clothes they were wearing, robes and trousers and turbans and other garments, the text specifies, as if preserving the detail for witnesses who would later need to confirm what happened. The binding was tight, professional, the work of soldiers who knew how to restrain men so that resistance was impossible. Whatever the 3 had done to prepare themselves spiritually for this moment, they were now physically helpless, unable to escape, unable to fight, unable to do anything except be carried toward the death their refusal had earned. The procession moved toward the furnace. The heat increased with every step, becoming painful and then dangerous as they approached the opening through which fuel was normally loaded. The soldiers who carried the bound prisoners pressed forward despite the growing intensity of the flames, their obedience to the king's command overriding the survival instincts that screamed at them to retreat. The door of the furnace was opened, and a blast of heat struck everyone within range with physical force. The soldiers threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the flames. What happened next should have been screams, the terrible sounds of men burning alive, the quick or slow death that fire inflicts on human flesh. The watching crowd should have witnessed the final lesson of the day, that defiance of Babylon led to destruction, that no god could challenge Nebuchadnezzar's supremacy, that the golden image before them was worthy of whatever worship it demanded. But that was not what happened. The soldiers who had thrown the prisoners into the furnace did not return from their task. The heat that had been merely painful at a distance proved fatal at the furnace's mouth. The strongest warriors of Babylon's army died in the act of executing their king's command, killed by the very flames intended to destroy the Hebrew captives. The first death of the day was not the 3 who had refused to bow, but the men who had obeyed the order to enforce compliance. And inside the furnace, where death should have been immediate and absolute, something impossible was occurring. The god whom Nebuchadnezzar had mocked, the deity whose power the king had dismissed as inadequate to rescue anyone from his hand, was about to demonstrate that the question had been answered correctly. What god could deliver from the king's furnace? The answer was walking in the flames. The furnace that Nebuchadnezzar had commandeered for this execution was not a structure designed for burning human beings. It was an industrial installation, built for the metalworking or brickmaking that Babylon's endless construction projects required, a kiln whose purpose was to transform raw materials into the components of empire. Its design reflected that function, a chamber large enough to accommodate significant quantities of material, openings that allowed for the loading of fuel and the insertion of whatever was being processed, ventilation that drew air to feed the flames and expelled smoke and gases that would otherwise have choked the fire. It was a tool, not a torture device, though Nebuchadnezzar had discovered that tools could serve multiple purposes when sufficient rage directed their use. The heat inside such a furnace, under normal operating conditions, would have been more than sufficient to kill any human being within seconds. Flesh began to burn at temperatures far below what metalworking required. The air itself became lethal long before flames made direct contact with skin. Superheated gases searing lungs, making it impossible to breathe, destroying the body from the inside even as the outside began to blacken and char. Death in a furnace was not the slow burning that fireside execution sometimes produced. It was rapid, overwhelming, the total consumption of everything that made a body human in a matter of moments. Nebuchadnezzar had ordered the furnace heated 7 times beyond its normal intensity. The hyperbole pointed toward an emotional truth, even if it exceeded physical possibility. The king wanted this furnace hotter than any furnace had ever been, wanted the destruction of these 3 defiant officials to be so complete that nothing remained to commemorate their resistance. The servants who tended the flames had responded to this command by piling on fuel until the structure itself seemed to strain against the energy it contained. The roar of the fire could be heard across the plain of Dura. The light of the flames competed with the sun, The heat radiating from the furnace's walls made approach difficult, and proximity to its opening fatal, as the strongest soldiers in Babylon's army had just discovered. Into this inferno, 3 bound men had been thrown. They had entered the furnace still wearing their official garments, the robes and trousers and turbans that marked their status as provincial administrators, the clothing that should have been the first thing to ignite when flame touched fabric. They had entered unable to move their arms or legs, bound so tightly that even the instinctive movements of self-protection were impossible. They had entered as helpless human beings facing forces that no human body could withstand, their survival entirely beyond their own capacity to secure. What Nebuchadnezzar expected to see, when he looked toward the furnace to confirm that his sentence had been executed, was nothing. The fire should have consumed everything: bodies, clothing, the very ropes that bound them, leaving not even bones to mark where the 3 Hebrews had died. The lesson for the assembled officials should have been written in absence, in the empty furnace that testified to the totality of destruction that awaited all who defied Babylon's king. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar saw something that made him leap to his feet in amazement. Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? The question emerged in tones of disbelief, the voice of a man whose eyes were reporting something his mind could not process. The king's advisors confirmed what everyone knew. Yes, 3 men, certainly, bound and thrown, no question about it. The execution had been public, witnessed by thousands, conducted by the army's most capable soldiers. 3 men had entered the furnace. This was established fact. Nebuchadnezzar's next words shattered every expectation the day had generated. "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." The statement contained multiple impossibilities, each one more staggering than the last. 4 men, not 3. Where had the 4th come from? Walking around, not writhing in agony or lying motionless in death, how could anyone walk in flames that had killed soldiers merely for approaching? Unbound, though they had been tied with the ropes that should have been the first thing to burn, who had released them? Unharmed, in an environment that destroyed everything it touched, what power could preserve human flesh against such heat? And then the final detail, the observation that elevated this scene from merely inexplicable to genuinely terrifying. The 4th figure looked like a son of the gods. The phrase in Aramaic could be translated various ways: a divine being, an angel, someone thus whose appearance suggested origin beyond the merely human. Nebuchadnezzar, for all his pretensions to divinity, recognized actual divinity when he saw it. Whatever was walking in that furnace alongside the 3 Hebrew officials was not of this world. Something had entered the flames that the king had not invited, had not anticipated, had not known existed until this moment forced recognition upon him. The watching crowd saw what their king saw, their eyes straining against the brightness of the flames, their minds struggling to interpret what their vision reported. The silhouettes in the furnace were unmistakable. 4 figures moving with apparent ease through an environment that should have permitted no movement at all. The flames that should have consumed them instead seemed to flow around them, as if some invisible barrier separated the fire from its intended victims. The scene was impossible, but it was happening. The miracle was unfolding in front of thousands of witnesses who would carry its memory for the rest of their lives. Inside the furnace itself, the experience of the 3 Hebrews defied any description that normal language could provide. They had entered expecting death, not hoping to escape, not counting on rescue, but prepared to die for the faith they had refused to compromise. The words they had spoken before Nebuchadnezzar had acknowledged this expectation. Even if he does not deliver us. They had walked into the flames as men walking into death, their hope fixed not on survival, but on the God who would receive them when survival ended. Instead, they found themselves standing in fire that did not burn, surrounded by flames that provided light and warmth, but not destruction, breathing air that should have seared their lungs but instead filled them with oxygen as pure as any they had ever tasted. The ropes that had bound them were gone, burned away perhaps, though nothing else had burned, or simply dissolved by whatever power was preserving everything else. They could move freely, could look around, could try to understand what was happening to them in this place, where nothing that was happening should have been possible, and they were not alone. The fourth figure that Nebuchadnezzar had observed from outside was present there in the flames with them, a being whose appearance communicated divine origin without requiring explanation. Tradition has offered various interpretations of this figure's identity: an angel sent to protect them, a theophany in which God himself appeared in visible form, a pre-incarnate appearance of the one who would later be born in Bethlehem. Whatever theological framework one brings to the interpretation, the experiential reality for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was unmistakable. They were not alone in the fire. The God they had trusted enough to die for had come to be with them in the dying. This was the answer to Nebuchadnezzar's mocking question, and it was not the answer he had expected. "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" the king had demanded, confident that no rescue was possible. But rescue had come, not by preventing them from entering the furnace, not by extinguishing the flames before they could do their work, but by entering the furnace with them, by being present in the place of destruction, by transforming the instrument of death into a space of divine encounter. The God of Israel had not delivered his servants from the fire. He had delivered them in the fire, through the fire, by joining them in the fire. The flames continued to burn, fed by the fuel that servants had piled in obedience to the king's command. The heat continued to radiate outward, still lethal to anyone who approached too closely, still capable of killing any normal human being who entered its reach. The furnace remained a furnace, its nature unchanged, its destructive capacity undiminished. What had changed was the situation of the three men inside it. They walked through death without dying, stood in destruction without being destroyed, inhabited an environment that should have ended their existence, and found instead that their existence was protected by a presence that transcended any force the environment could generate. For Nebuchadnezzar, watching from his throne, the minutes that passed while the four figures walked in the flames must have seemed like hours. Every assumption he had brought to this confrontation was collapsing. He had believed his power was supreme. Now he saw power that exceeded his own operating casually in his furnace. He had believed the gods of conquered peoples were defeated gods, proven inferior by the fact of conquest. Now he saw one of those supposedly defeated gods, demonstrating capabilities that none of Babylon's deities had ever displayed. He had believed that the choice he offered, bow or burn, was a genuine choice, its outcome entirely within his control. Now he saw that the burning he had decreed had been overruled by an authority that did not recognize his jurisdiction. The theological implications were shattering. If the God of Israel could do this, could walk in flames, could preserve human beings from destruction, could manifest his presence in the heart of Babylonian power, then what else might that God be capable of? The fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the exile of the Jews, none of these proved what Nebuchadnezzar had assumed they proved. The God of Israel had not been defeated by Babylon's armies. He had allowed Jerusalem to fall for reasons of his own, reasons that his prophets had explained but that Nebuchadnezzar had never bothered to understand. This God was not weak. He was sovereign, and sovereign meant that he did what he chose to do, intervened when he chose to intervene, and demonstrated his power when and how he saw fit. The golden image still stood on the plain of Dura, 90 feet of gold blazing in the Mesopotamian sun. The officials who had bowed, before it remained assembled, though their attention had shifted entirely from the statue to the furnace. The ceremony that was supposed to unify the empire in worship of Nebuchadnezzar's chosen symbol had become something else entirely, a demonstration of a power that the golden image could not represent, and that the king who had erected it could not command. Nebuchadnezzar made his decision. Whatever was happening in that furnace, whoever the fourth figure might be, the three Hebrews needed to come out. They needed to be seen, needed to be examined, needed to be questioned about what they had experienced. The king who had thrown them in was now going to call them out, and in doing so, he was going to acknowledge publicly that his furnace had failed, that his power had limits, that the God he had mocked was worthy of respect he had not offered. The king approached the furnace as closely as the heat would allow. The flames still roared, still burned, still killed anyone who came too near. But Nebuchadnezzar raised his voice above the roar and called out to the men whose death he had ordered only minutes before. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. The title he used was significant: servants of the Most High God. Not servants of a defeated deity, not worshippers of an impotent foreign god, but servants of the Most High, the supreme deity, the God above all gods, the one whose power had just been demonstrated in terms that no one present could deny. Nebuchadnezzar was not converting to the faith of Israel, but he was acknowledging something he had not acknowledged before. The God these men served was real, was powerful, was capable of acts that exceeded anything Babylon's gods had ever accomplished. The three Hebrews heard the summons. The fourth figure who had walked with them in the flames remained with them until the end, present until presence was no longer needed, visible until the moment of exit made his visibility unnecessary. Then, as Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego moved toward the opening through which they had been thrown, the fourth figure was simply no longer there, not departed in any visible way, simply no longer present, his work complete, his protection no longer required. Three men emerged from a furnace that should have killed them. They stepped out into the light of the Mesopotamian sun, into the presence of the king who had condemned them, into the view of thousands of officials who had witnessed their execution and were now witnessing their resurrection from what should have been certain death. The miracle was complete, but its full impact would only become clear when those who had witnessed it came close enough to examine what the fire had, and had not, accomplished. The crowd that had watched from a distance now pressed forward, drawn by the irresistible human need to see, to touch, to verify what their eyes had reported from afar. The satraps and prefects, the governors and advisors, the treasurers and judges and magistrates, all the officials who had prostrated themselves before the golden image now gathered around the three men who had refused to bow. They came as witnesses, certainly, knowing that what they saw would become the subject of testimony for the rest of their lives. But they also came as investigators, their minds seeking evidence that might explain what their assumptions could not accommodate. What they found defied explanation entirely. The three Hebrews stood in the midst of this scrutiny, with the calm that had characterized their behavior throughout the ordeal. They had not emerged from the furnace wild-eyed with the frenzy of a narrow escape. They did not gasp for air or clutch at their bodies searching for wounds. They simply stood there, available for inspection, their composure itself a kind of testimony to the completeness of what had been accomplished on their behalf. The officials examined them with the thoroughness that their professional training had instilled. They looked at the skin, exposed hands and faces and arms, searching for the burns that should have covered every inch, the blistering and charring that fire inevitably produced. They found nothing. The skin was unmarked, as healthy as it had been that morning when the three men had dressed for what should have been an ordinary day of administrative duties. Not a blister, not a scar, not even the reddening that mild heat exposure would have caused. The fire had left no trace on their bodies. They examined the clothing, the robes and trousers and turbans that the text had specifically noted, the official garments that should have been the first thing to ignite when flame touched fabric. The clothing was intact, not singed at the edges, not discoloured by smoke, not even warm to the touch. Fabric that should have burned instantly had passed through the furnace as if fire held no power over it. The officials touched the garments, rubbed the material between their fingers, searched for any indication of what the clothing had endured. They found nothing but ordinary fabric in ordinary condition. They searched for the ropes that had bound the three men. The soldiers had tied them securely before throwing them into the furnace, tight enough that movement was impossible. Professional binding that the army's strongest warriors had applied. Where were those ropes now? Gone. Burned away, perhaps, though nothing else had burned, or simply released by whatever power had protected everything else. The three men stood unbound, as free in their bodies as they had always been in their spirits. And then the most remarkable discovery of all, the detail that would be repeated in the retelling for millennia afterward. The officials leaned in close, drew breath near the three survivors, and detected no smell of smoke. This was not merely the absence of burning, this was the absence of any trace of fire whatsoever. Anyone who had ever stood near a flame knew that smoke clung to clothing and hair, that the smell of fire persisted long after the fire itself was extinguished. A person who had merely walked past a cooking fire would carry that smell for hours. These three men had stood in the heart of an inferno heated 7 times beyond its normal intensity, had been surrounded by flames that killed professional soldiers at the furnace door, had spent minutes in an environment saturated with combustion and its products, and they smelled like men who had just risen from their beds, fresh and clean, and completely untouched by what they had experienced. The crowd stood in silence as the implications settled over them. This was not a trick, not an illusion, not a lucky escape through some previously undiscovered property of furnace design. This was a miracle in the most literal sense of the word, an event that could not be explained by natural causes, an intervention by a power that transcended the normal operations of the physical world. The God of these three Hebrew officials had reached into the heart of Babylon's most fearsome instrument of execution and had simply suspended the rules by which that instrument operated. Fire had not burned because fire had been commanded not to burn. Heat had not killed because heat had been forbidden to kill. Nebuchadnezzar observed this examination from the proximity that his royal dignity required, close enough to see what others saw, far enough to maintain the distance that separated kings from common officials. But distance could not protect him from the theological revolution that was unfolding. Everything he thought he knew about power, about gods, about the relationship between conquest and divine supremacy, was being dismantled in front of him. The three men he had condemned to death stood alive and unharmed, their survival a testimony to a power that exceeded his own in ways he had not imagined possible. The king spoke, and his words carried across the assembly with the weight of formal decree. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. The statement was extraordinary, coming from a monarch who had just attempted to force universal worship of his own golden image. Nebuchadnezzar was not abandoning his gods or converting to the faith of Israel, but he was acknowledging, publicly and formally, that the God of these three Hebrews deserved praise, that this God had acted, had sent a messenger, had accomplished a rescue that none of Babylon's deities could have managed. The king who had asked, "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" was now praising the God who had done exactly that. But Nebuchadnezzar's declaration went further, identifying what had made the rescue necessary in the first place. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. The words contained an admission that must have cost the king something to speak. These men had defied his command. They had refused what he had ordered. They had looked at the full apparatus of Babylonian power, the golden image, the assembled officials, the roaring furnace, and had chosen to disobey. Under normal circumstances, such defiance would have been rewarded with death, and Nebuchadnezzar would have been satisfied that order had been maintained. But these were not normal circumstances. The God these men trusted had validated their defiance by rescuing them from its consequences. Their willingness to die rather than worship any other god had been honoured by the God they refused to abandon. The king's next words transformed the event from local incident to imperial policy. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other god can save in this way. The decree was characteristically Babylonian in its brutality. The penalties Nebuchadnezzar announced were extreme even by ancient standards, but the content was revolutionary. The king was extending formal protection to the God of Israel throughout his empire, forbidding anyone from speaking against the deity who had just demonstrated power that no other god could match. The same king who had demanded worship of his golden image was now threatening to execute anyone who disrespected the god who had nullified that demand. This was not conversion, but it was acknowledgement. Nebuchadnezzar was not becoming a worshipper of Israel's God, but he was recognizing that this god occupied a category different from all the other deities that Babylon encountered. No other god can save in this way. The statement placed the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a class by himself, above and beyond the gods of nations that Babylon had conquered and continued to conquer. The furnace had accomplished something that prophetic preaching might never have achieved. It had forced the most powerful ruler in the world to publicly acknowledge the supremacy of Israel's God. Then came the final element of Nebuchadnezzar's response: promotion. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The men who had been dragged before the throne as criminals were now elevated to higher positions than they had occupied before their defiance. The officials who had refused to bow were given greater authority than the officials who had bowed. The punishment that should have been their death became the occasion for their advancement. Nebuchadnezzar, whatever his limitations in understanding the God of Israel, understood political reality well enough to recognize that men who commanded such divine protection were assets rather than liabilities. Better to have them serving the empire than to create any further occasions for their God to demonstrate his power. The assembly dispersed slowly, the officials returning to their provinces and their duties, carrying with them a story that would spread across the empire like fire across dry grass. The golden image still stood on the plain of Dura, still blazed in the sun, still represented whatever Nebuchadnezzar had intended it to represent. But its power to command worship had been fundamentally undermined. How could anyone bow before a golden statue with the same conviction after seeing what they had seen? How could the gods of Babylon claim supremacy after the God of 3 Hebrew exiles had demonstrated capabilities beyond anything they could offer? The 3 men themselves, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, walked away from the plain of Dura with the quietness that had characterized them from the beginning. They did not boast of their survival or claim credit for their deliverance. They did not deliver triumphant speeches about the superiority of their faith or the vindication of their choices. They simply returned to their lives, to the administrative duties that awaited them, to the daily challenges of serving a foreign empire while remaining faithful to a God that empire did not worship. But something had changed in them, something that the external observers could not fully perceive. They had entered the furnace prepared to die. They had walked into flames expecting that their faithfulness would cost them everything, that the God they served would receive their worship as a final offering consumed by fire. Instead, they had encountered that God in the fire itself. They had been met in their extremity by a presence that transformed the place of death into a place of communion. They had learned, in ways that no teaching could convey, that the God they served was not distant or abstract, but intimately present, willing to enter the worst situations his servants faced and to walk with them through whatever those situations demanded. The 4th figure in the furnace, whoever or whatever he was, had not merely protected them from flames. He had revealed something about the nature of God that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. Their God was not a God who only delivered his servants from trouble. He was a God who accompanied them through trouble, who stood with them in the midst of circumstances that seemed impossible to survive. The furnace had been terrifying, but the presence in the furnace had been more powerful than the terror. The fire had been real, but the protection had been more real still. The sun began to set over the plain of Dura, painting the golden image in shades of orange and red that seemed to echo the flames of the furnace that had burned so fiercely hours before. The crowds were gone now, the officials scattered to their various destinations, the ceremony that had begun in such pomp concluding in such unprecedented fashion. The furnace itself had cooled enough for servants to begin cleaning out the remains of the fuel that had fed its flames, disposing of whatever was left of the soldiers whose obedience had cost them their lives. 3 men who should have been part of that disposal walked through the gates of Babylon as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They had been tested and found faithful. They had been condemned and found delivered. They had been thrown into fire and had found their God already there, waiting for them, ready to walk with them through the flames. The story they carried would outlive Babylon itself, would be told and retold across millennia, would inspire generations of believers who faced their own furnaces and needed to know that faithfulness did not mean facing fire alone. What happened on the plain of Dura that day was not merely an ancient miracle, but an eternal truth, revealed in a specific time and place, but applicable to every time and every place, where human beings faced impossible choices and needed to know whether God could be trusted. He could, he was, and he would continue to meet his people in their fires for as long as fires burned and faith endured to face them. The furnace on the plain of Dura was a specific historical reality, an industrial installation in ancient Babylon, repurposed for execution on a particular day in the 6th century before the Common Era. But furnaces are also metaphors, and the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego has endured across millennia precisely because the metaphor speaks to experiences that transcend any particular time or place. Every generation has its furnaces. Every life encounters moments when the choice is between compromise and destruction, when the powers that demand conformity threaten consequences that seem impossible to survive. The flames that burned on the plain of Dura continue to burn wherever human beings face the cost of conviction. What does it cost to refuse when everyone else is bowing? The three Hebrews understood this cost with a clarity that their comfortable years in Babylonian administration might have obscured. They had risen to positions of influence, had achieved success that most exiles could never have imagined, had found a way to serve a foreign empire without betraying their fundamental commitments. Their lives in Babylon were not painful. They were prosperous. Their situation was not desperate. It was privileged. When the music sounded and the crowds bowed, they could have calculated that one gesture, one moment of external compliance, would preserve everything they had built. They could have told themselves that God knew their hearts, that bowing before a statue meant nothing if they did not truly worship it, that survival was its own kind of faithfulness that would allow them to serve God in the future, rather than dying uselessly in the present. These arguments were available to them. They rejected them all. They understood that faithfulness was not measured only in hearts but in bodies, not only in private convictions but in public actions. The bow that everyone else offered was not merely a physical gesture. It was a declaration of allegiance, an acknowledgement that Nebuchadnezzar's golden image was worthy of the worship that belonged to God alone. To bow would have been to lie with their bodies even if their hearts remained true. To bow would have been to participate in idolatry, regardless of their internal reservations. To bow would have been to compromise in a way that would have corroded their integrity from the inside out, making the next compromise easier and the one after that easier still, until nothing remained of the faith they had carried from Jerusalem except a distant memory of convictions they had once held strongly enough to die for. The cost of their refusal was immediate and stark, death by fire. But the cost of compliance would have been slower and subtler. The gradual erosion of everything that made them who they were. They chose the immediate cost because they understood that the gradual cost was ultimately more destructive. Better to die faithful than to live compromised. Better to face flames that would end the body than to accept the slow burning that would consume the soul. This calculus is not obvious to those who have never faced a furnace. From a distance, survival seems like the obvious choice, the reasonable preference, the only sensible response to overwhelming power. But those who have stood at the furnace door know something that distant observers cannot fully grasp. There are worse things than dying. There is living as something less than what you were created to be. There is looking in the mirror and seeing a person who abandoned their deepest commitments when those commitments became expensive. There is the knowledge that you chose comfort over conviction, safety over integrity, survival over the values that made survival worth having in the first place. The three Hebrews refused to pay that price. Their refusal was not suicidal. They did not seek death for its own sake, did not embrace martyrdom as a positive good. They simply recognized that some things were more valuable than life, and that the God they served was one of those things. That even if he does not was not resignation but resolution, not despair but the deepest kind of hope. Hope that looked past immediate circumstances to eternal realities. Hope that valued faithfulness more than survival, because faithfulness connected them to a God whose resources exceeded anything the furnace could destroy. The ripples from what happened on the plain of Dura spread outward in every direction, transforming the environment in ways that the three Hebrews could not have anticipated when they made their decision. For the exiled community of Israel, scattered across the Babylonian Empire in pockets of displacement and grief, the news arrived like water in a desert. The exiles had watched their nation destroyed, their temple burned, their king humiliated. They had been forced to ask whether their God had been defeated, whether the promises that had sustained their ancestors were empty words that Babylonian armies had exposed as illusions. The prophets who spoke to them in exile, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, others whose names we do not know, had insisted that God remained sovereign, that the exile was discipline rather than defeat, that restoration would come in due time. But prophetic words competed with the visible evidence of Babylonian supremacy. and faith was hard to maintain when everything visible suggested that faith was foolish. The story of the furnace changed that calculus. Here was evidence, concrete and undeniable, that the God of Israel was not defeated. Here was proof that his power exceeded anything Babylon could generate, that his presence could enter the heart of Babylonian power and protect his servants from its most extreme expressions. The God who had seemed absent when Jerusalem fell was manifestly present when his faithful servants needed him most. The exiles who heard this story found their faith renewed, their hope rekindled, their confidence in divine promises strengthened by a demonstration that no amount of theological argument could have provided. The story became part of the repertoire that sustained Jewish identity through centuries of dispersion and persecution. When later generations faced their own furnaces, the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes, the destructions of Rome, the pogroms of medieval Europe, the horrors of the 20th century, they remembered 3 young men who had refused to bow and had been delivered. The memory did not guarantee that every faithful person would experience the same deliverance. History is full of martyrs whose faithfulness was rewarded not with rescue but with the crown of death. But the memory testified that God was present in the fire, that faithfulness was not futile, that the powers that threatened destruction were not ultimate. The furnace could kill the body, but it could not kill the faith of those who trusted in something stronger than fire. For Babylon itself, the implications were equally profound, though they unfolded differently. The empire that had assumed its gods were supreme had been forced to acknowledge a god whose power exceeded theirs. Nebuchadnezzar's decree protecting the God of Israel was not conversion, but it was concession, an admission that Babylonian theology could not account for what had happened, that the categories by which Babylon understood divine power needed revision. The officials who had witnessed the miracle returned to their provinces carrying questions they had not asked before. The certainties of Babylonian religion had been shaken by an event that could not be explained within Babylonian frameworks. This did not transform Babylon overnight. The empire continued to worship its traditional gods, continued to build its temples and offer its sacrifices, continued to assume that military conquest proved divine favour. But a seed had been planted, a testimony recorded, an alternative possibility introduced into the consciousness of a culture that had thought itself invulnerable. The God who walked in fire was not limited to Israel. He was Lord of all creation, and his power was not diminished by the destruction of Jerusalem. The exiles who served this God were not adherents of a defeated religion. They were witnesses to a deity whose capabilities exceeded anything Babylon's gods had demonstrated. For the 3 men themselves, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the experience produced a transformation that went deeper than the external deliverance might suggest. They had entered the furnace as men of faith. They emerged as men who had experienced what their faith pointed toward. Before the furnace, they believed that God was able to deliver them. After the furnace, they knew that God's presence was more valuable than deliverance itself. Before the furnace, they trusted that faithfulness was worth any cost. After the furnace, they had received that faithfulness back with interest, their commitment vindicated in ways that exceeded their expectations. Before the furnace, they feared the fire. After the furnace, they feared nothing, because they had discovered that the worst thing their enemies could do was the occasion for the greatest thing their God would do. The fear that had made the furnace terrifying was dissolved not by the removal of danger, but by the presence of one who transcended danger. They had learned the experiential reality of what the psalmist had written. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The furnace was the valley, the shadow of death was real, and the evil they faced was immediate and overwhelming. But the you are with me had proven to be more real than all of it combined. The 4th figure in the flames had transformed their understanding of what it meant to serve God in a hostile world. This transformation equipped them for whatever challenges the future might bring. They would continue to serve in Babylonian administration, continue to navigate the complexities of exile, continue to face situations that required wisdom and courage and faithfulness. But they would face these situations as men who had been to the furnace and back, men who knew from direct experience that no circumstance was beyond God's reach, that no threat was ultimate, that no fire burned hot enough to separate them from the presence of the one who had walked with them in the flames. The furnace had not merely preserved their lives, it had deepened their faith to a degree that no other experience could have accomplished. The world that demanded their compromise would continue to demand it. Babylon would continue to erect its images, issue its decrees, threaten its punishments. The pressures that had pushed them toward the furnace would continue to push in similar directions, seeking conformity, demanding allegiance, refusing to tolerate the exclusive claims that the God of Israel made on those who served him. Nothing about the external environment had changed. Everything about their internal capacity to face that environment had been transformed. They had been to the fire, they had found God there, and they emerged knowing that whatever furnaces the future might hold, they would not face them alone. The story of the fiery furnace is not primarily a story about three men who were brave, though they were brave. It is not primarily a story about an empire that was defeated, though its pretensions were exposed. It is a story about a God who enters the worst places his people can find themselves and transforms those places through his presence. The furnace was meant to destroy. It became the site of revelation. The flames were meant to consume. They became the backdrop for an encounter with divinity. The execution was meant to silence. It became the most eloquent testimony to divine power that Babylon had ever witnessed. The meaning of the fire was not the fire itself, but what the fire revealed about the God who walked through it. And that meaning continues to speak wherever people face circumstances that seem designed to destroy them. Wherever the choice between faithfulness and survival seems impossible. Wherever the furnaces of life burn hot and the fourth figure is needed to walk through them with those who cannot walk alone. The pattern revealed in the furnace of Babylon was not new. It was, rather, the visible demonstration of something that had been true since the beginning of God's dealings with humanity, a principle woven into the fabric of how the Creator relates to his creation. The God of Scripture is not primarily a God who removes his people from difficulty, but a God who accompanies them through it. The story of the fiery furnace fits into a larger story, a pattern of divine presence in human extremity that runs like a golden thread through the entire tapestry of sacred history. When the Israelites faced the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army behind them, God did not transport them magically to the other side. He opened a path through the waters and walked with them as they crossed on dry ground, the walls of the sea rising on either side, the threat still visible, the danger still real, but the presence more real than the danger. When they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, God did not simply deposit them in the promised land and spare them the journey. He travelled with them, a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, guiding them through the barren places, providing manna when they hungered and water when they thirsted, present in every step of the long road between slavery and freedom. When David hid in caves, fleeing from Saul's murderous jealousy, God did not immediately establish him on the throne he had been promised. He met David in those caves, received the psalms that poured out of that anguish, shaped the shepherd boy into the king he would become through years of hardship that could have been avoided but were instead transformed. When Elijah sat beneath the broom tree and begged to die, God did not lecture him about the weakness of his faith or dismiss his despair as unworthy. He sent an angel with bread and water, let the exhausted prophet sleep, and then met him on the mountain with a voice that was not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but in the gentle whisper that spoke after the storm had passed. This is who God is. This is how God works. Not always removing the furnace, but always entering it. Not always preventing the fire, but always walking through it with those who must face it. The fourth figure in Babylon's flames was not an anomaly, but a revelation, the visible manifestation of an invisible truth that had always been operative. The God of Israel does not abandon his people to their suffering, but joins them in it, transforms it by his presence, makes the valley of the shadow of death a place where fear loses its power because the shepherd is there. The theological implications of this pattern are profound and sometimes uncomfortable. If God's primary mode of operation were the removal of difficulty, then the presence of difficulty would indicate the absence of God. Every furnace would be evidence that God had withdrawn his protection, every trial proof that faith had failed, every hardship a sign that the sufferer had been abandoned to forces that God was either unwilling or unable to address. This is not the God revealed in Scripture. The God revealed in Scripture enters furnaces. His presence does not guarantee escape from difficulty. It guarantees companionship through difficulty. His faithfulness is demonstrated not by the removal of suffering, but by the transformation of suffering into something that cannot destroy those who are held by his hand. This is harder than it sounds. The human preference is for rescue, for the elimination of pain, for the rapid resolution of crisis into comfort. We would rather be delivered from the fire than delivered in it. We would rather skip the furnace entirely than find God waiting for us inside. This preference is natural, and Scripture does not condemn it. The Psalms are full of cries for rescue, for intervention, for the swift defeat of enemies and the rapid cessation of suffering. God hears these cries and sometimes answers them with exactly the deliverance they request. But he also sometimes answers them differently, meeting his people in circumstances he does not remove, walking with them through valleys he does not fill in, providing presence when he does not provide escape. The three Hebrews understood this, that even if he does not acknowledge both possibilities, God might deliver them from the flames, or he might not. Either way, they would trust him. Either way, they would remain faithful. Either way, they would discover that he was with them, in rescue or in death, in deliverance or in martyrdom, in the miraculous suspension of fire's power, or in the passage through fire into the presence they had served. Their faith was not contingent on outcome, but anchored in relationship. They did not worship a God who was useful. They worshipped a God who was worthy, regardless of what his worthiness produced in their immediate circumstances. The fourth figure in the furnace has been interpreted in many ways across the centuries of reflection on this story. Some see an angel, a messenger sent by God to protect his servants in their hour of need. Some see a theophany, a direct appearance of God himself in visible form, the same kind of encounter that Abraham experienced when 3 visitors came to his tent, and one of them spoke with divine authority. Some see a Christophany, an appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ, the eternal Son of God, manifesting himself centuries before Bethlehem, to walk with his people in their suffering. The interpretations vary, but the reality they all point toward remains constant. God was there. In the furnace, in the flames, in the heart of what should have meant destruction, God was present with his people. This presence is what the story offers to all who hear it, not as a guarantee of miraculous escape, but as an assurance of divine companionship. The furnaces of human experience take many forms. Illness burns with its own kind of fire, consuming strength and hope, threatening to reduce life to ashes of pain and limitation. Grief burns with flames that seem unquenchable. The loss of those we love, creating a conflagration that scorches everything it touches. Failure burns, and rejection burns, and the slow destruction of dreams burns with a heat that can feel just as lethal as Nebuchadnezzar's industrial kiln. The circumstances vary endlessly, but the experience of being in the fire is universal. Everyone, at some point, finds themselves surrounded by flames they did not choose and cannot escape. To all who find themselves in such flames, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego speaks a word of hope that is not trite or simplistic. It does not promise that the fire will be extinguished or that escape is imminent. It does not offer formulas for miraculous deliverance or techniques for avoiding the suffering that comes to every human life. It offers something different, something that may be harder to receive but is ultimately more sustaining. It offers the presence of one who enters the fire rather than observing it from a safe distance. The fourth figure in the furnace was not shouting instructions from outside the flames, telling the 3 Hebrews what to do to save themselves. He was inside with them, walking where they walked, standing where they stood, sharing the space that was meant to destroy them. His presence did not eliminate the fire. The flames continued to burn, continued to roar, continued to kill anyone else who came too close. But his presence changed what the fire could do to those he accompanied. The flames that consumed soldiers at the furnace door could not touch those who walked with the one who transcended fire. The heat that should have been lethal became harmless in the presence of one for whom no heat was too great. This is the promise that the story extends, not as magic, but as reality. You are not alone in your furnace. Whatever fire surrounds you, whatever flames threaten to consume you, whatever heat presses against you from every direction, you do not face it by yourself. The God who walked in Babylon's furnace walks in yours. The presence that protected 3 Hebrew exiles is available to all who call upon the name of the one who sent it. The 4th figure is still walking in fires, still entering the places where his people suffer, still transforming circumstances of destruction into encounters with divine love. This does not make the fire pleasant. The story does not suggest that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego enjoyed their time in the furnace, or that they experienced it as anything other than the crisis it was. Presence does not eliminate pain, it transforms the meaning of pain. Companionship does not remove difficulty, it makes difficulty bearable. The fire remains fire, real, hot, dangerous to everything that tries to survive it alone. But those who do not face it alone discover resources they did not know they had. Strength that does not come from within but from the one who walks beside them. A capacity to endure that exceeds anything their own reserves could supply. The story speaks with particular power to those who face impossible choices. The pressure to bow, to conform, to compromise in ways that preserve comfort at the cost of integrity. This pressure is perennial, present in every age and every culture, taking different forms but always demanding the same surrender. The world always has its golden images, always commands worship, always threatens consequences for those who refuse. The cost of standing upright when everyone else bows can seem unbearable, the furnace that awaits those who refuse appearing too hot to survive. To those facing such choices, the story says, "You are not the first." Others have stood where you stand, faced what you face, felt the heat that you feel. They did not bow, and they did not burn, not because they were special, but because the God they served was faithful. There, even if he does not, is available to you as well. The recognition that faithfulness is not contingent on outcome, that integrity is worth preserving even when preservation seems to guarantee destruction, that some things are more valuable than survival, and that the God who asks for faithfulness is the God who provides the presence that makes faithfulness possible. The story speaks also to those who stand alone. The 3 Hebrews had each other, 3 friends bound together by shared faith, facing the furnace as a community rather than as isolated individuals. But there are furnaces that must be entered alone, circumstances in which no human companion walks beside us, times when the support of community is absent and the only presence available is the divine presence that no circumstance can remove. In those lonely furnaces, the 4th figure becomes even more essential. He is the companion who never leaves, the presence that no isolation can diminish, the one who walks where others cannot follow and meets his people in the depths that human companionship cannot reach. The flames that burn in human experience will not be fully extinguished until the age to come, when death itself is cast into the lake of fire and every tear is wiped from every eye. Until that day, furnaces will continue to roar, fires will continue to burn, and the people of God will continue to find themselves in circumstances that threaten to consume everything they value. This is not evidence of divine absence, but the arena of divine presence, not proof that faith has failed, but the opportunity for faith to discover what it has always been trusting in. The one who walked in Babylon's furnace is walking still. He has not retired from furnace walking, has not withdrawn to a safe distance from the fires that burn in human lives. He enters every fire that his people enter, shares every suffering that his people endure, provides in every extremity the presence that transforms destruction into encounter. He does not always remove the flames, but he always enters them. He does not always provide escape, but he always provides himself. And in the end, his presence proves to be more than enough, more than sufficient for the fire, more than adequate for the trial, more than equal to whatever furnace life can build. The night deepens, and the story settles into the quiet that follows its telling. Babylon is dust now, its golden image melted down and lost to history, its furnace cold for millennia, its emperor's bones mingled with the soil of a land that barely remembers his name. But the God who walked in that ancient fire is alive forever, unchanged by the centuries, undimmed by the passage of time, still entering furnaces, still walking with his people, still revealing himself in the flames. If you are in a furnace tonight, if life has heated to temperatures you did not choose and cannot control, if circumstances press against you like flame-seeking entry, If the fire feels hot enough to destroy everything you are, then hear the word that the story offers: you are not alone. The fourth figure walks in your fire as surely as he walked in theirs. The presence that protected 3 Hebrew exiles is available to you, offered not as a reward for special faithfulness, but as a gift of grace to all who will receive it. The fire is real. The heat is genuine. The danger is not imaginary or exaggerated, but the one who walks in the fire is more real than the flames, his protection more powerful than the heat, his presence sufficient for whatever the furnace demands. You do not face it alone. You have never faced it alone, and you never will. The God who met Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon's furnace is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He has not changed, and his faithfulness has not diminished. Whatever fire burns around you, he is there. Whatever flames threaten to consume you, he walks beside you. Whatever furnace life has built, he has already entered it, already made it a place where his presence can be found, already transformed it from a site of destruction into an opportunity for encounter. Rest now in that presence. Let the heat of your circumstances be met by the warmth of his companionship. Let the fear that fire always generates be dissolved by the perfect love that casts out fear. Let the story of 3 men who walk through flames with a 4th figure beside them become your story as well. Not because your fire will necessarily be extinguished tonight, but because the one who walks in fire walks with you, and where he walks, destruction cannot follow. The furnace may still burn, but you're not alone in the flames, and that makes all the difference.